I now have to install the network infrastructure and what's called models. So what's starting to the
That's why we here are not English colony anymore, right? Sorry, Phil. We're not.
so that
And it's because we adopted those
when
techniques that we
install
were
the
able to
network
defeat
infrastructure
a
and what's
larger,
called
better equipped,
models.
better trained army,
So what's
as well as others. Now, despite this organizational foundation and all of these writings I surrounded myself with, I actually initially based the work of the IDC on the tactics I learned as a student and as an architect, which now feels amazingly foolish to admit, but this seems like a safe place. The word's not going to get out that I was so ill-founded in my work initially. But you produce based on the framework you kind of experienced. And yes, not surprisingly, the work had little value. It had value. So, for example, this project here that you're looking at was done for a group called Healing House of Lafayette. Healing House of Lafayette provides services, mental health services to kids who had seen incredibly traumatic events and their family doesn't have means to actually afford the therapy that they need to heal from those events. So they provide free services. Every year they ask 3 design entities to produce a playhouse that they then auction off. They give each of these entities $3,500 at the time. I hope it increased a little bit, inflation, 20 years, right? But $3,500 to produce a playhouse. And at this time, the IDC was very much embedded in curriculum. So I taught a class kind of around this work, and one of the students asked innocently, what happens to the money, the $3,500, if we don't use it? I can't take credit for that. Wasn't my question. But I would take credit for listening and asking the agency what happens. They said, well, we get it. So we decided to not spend any money and build a playhouse, right? Which sounds great until you actually have to build something tangible for free. So we spent some time scouring the countryside around Lafayette, Louisiana, eventually finding out that there was a rather robust furniture making industry in our own backyard that had lots of offcuts that we could have for free. So we piled these offcuts up, having no idea what we were going to do with them, until we eventually invented a strategy where we would drill a hole every 6 inches, and then we'd use threaded rod bolts and washers to connect it and build the thing, which we then practiced and set out doing. There was not a floor plan, there was not an elevation, there was not a section, there was not a digital model, there was nothing. It existed only in physical space as a direct experimentation with this new method of building that we had designed, which created all sorts of questions about, okay, if we just abandoned the entire largely hierarchical linear design, then construct, then occupy process, and on the path to that end, like began to question what's the value of a floor plan, then are there other things we ought to question as well as we design a new method of working? This work, by the way, we ended up donating 25. We had to spend $1,000 on hardware and treated wood so the thing wouldn't fall apart right away. But we were able to give a $2,500 donation, and then the thing was auctioned off for $4,500, so $7,000. We felt good, so it was good work, but it wasn't work that I knew would resonate in the places where I wanted to operate. Places that are offensively known as slums or incorrectly known as informal settlements, places that generate work and propagate virally without permission. It is not a top-down kind of space where things are actually go through code review and all of this. It just generates. Ideas move from person to person to person. Good ones and not so good ones. And so for me, it was like, how do I generate work in that space? How do we change the way that we practice so as to be of some use there? Now, I can't show today 2 decades of work. Some of you just breathed a sigh of relief. I'm not going to. It's available online. You can find it, Q&A, we can unearth it. But I am going to show a work that is starting to ask questions. Okay, that's all fine and good. And over the last 20 years, we've done a lot of work, but in other parts of the world where we operate in the context I just talked about. So go to South Africa, build a maker space, 10 days with a team of 10 for $1,500, and it's great. And the work does propagate a little bit as our host community takes the ideas that we generated through that largely experimental process, very similar to the one I just alluded to or described, and then does other things with that, builds homes and clinics and things that we have no hands on whatsoever. They're just doing, right? And so it's good work. but it's work that I can only do 3 weeks out of the year, which leaves 49. And the question is like, what can I do in those other 49 weeks? What can we do in those other 49 weeks? What can we do within our own community? A question prompted by the kind of tense nature of political discourse and the kind of inner angst I felt around that, and just kind of rolling up my sleeves and saying, I can't really deal with any of that. There's nothing I can do about changing that aside from, doom scrolling and wringing my hands and like rocking back and forth, I think. But I could take the IDC's work and say, we're going to dedicate the next few years in our own backyard, in our own little tiny way. We're going to make the lives of a few people slightly better. And that's good. That's good enough. That's what we're going to do. But hopefully helpful. But to do that, we had to figure out how to design a different pattern of working. Pattern of working aligned with the supports that the US market has, which is different than the supports in community-based processes. So most of those processes are fundamentally misaligned from the way we act together as people, right? And so like, let's talk for a second about, let's hold a community meeting to figure out what design strategy we want to use. So then you schedule that meeting at a certain time in a certain place, you gather everyone together, you patiently listen to everyone, you write it on a whiteboard or wherever you want to write it, you talk through the ideas, and you come out the end with a resolved path forward. It's a consensus, right? Sounds great. It's something that the problem is, well, you schedule that in the evening. Now you've just excluded single parent households and anyone who works at night. You schedule at a certain location. You've excluded anyone who can't gain access. If you push it online, anyone who doesn't have access to that technology is at a disadvantage to participate. We all understand that in a space where we're all talking together, the first thing said will have a huge influence over everything said thereafter because of information cascade. Because we are social creatures and delve into social comparison, we eventually will align ourselves with that first idea in the subsequent conversation, even if we don't actually believe it. So we get a false consensus, which breeds groupthink and herding, right? We understand these things. You talk to any sociologist out there, they'll say that is probably the worst way. Oh, and then we couch the whole conversation in drawings and models that we understand as a field, but the rest of the world is like, what? And we're mystified when out of that conversation comes largely inert work that actually has minimal impact. And everyone feels slightly dissatisfied with the conversation they have. Of course, we've designed a silly system at odds with our human nature. And so how do we design a different way? And I'm not saying I have it. Like, we just started rolling up our sleeves and saying, like, what could this look like, a year ago? So we're still very much in its infancy, right? But we did land on a space in Jefferson Chalmers, an area that's seen quite a bit of disinvestment over the last few years. There was, and I should have mentioned this before here. Is it, did I blow? Oh, nope, I'm sorry. I'm giving you a, sorry. Ignore that. You didn't see those things. That's a prelude. There. So a bunch of partners, IDCs, the IDC, you see it there. Building International, a fantastic architecture firm that does work schools, specifically educational work here. Hope, which is that church right there, that the minute they paid off that building in Jefferson Chalmers, the very next week they said, we're going to give away the basement space so that Shalom Ministries and others can offer free mental health services, nutritional justice programming, political organization, trying to think, a whole list of things, yoga classes, like a whole bunch of stuff that would be of value to the community that the community right now doesn't have any access to whatsoever, right? So kind of a grassroots activism. And they were going to give their whole basement away to do this, which is awesome, but the space has all the charm of an 1880s church basement, which of course it is. And one that saw massive flooding 5 years ago. And those of you who have seen that flooding know that it's not just water that's flooding the space to the tune of 3 or 4 feet. Actually, they painted it. In the next image I'm going to see, you're going to see a paint change. That's the height of the flood. They immortalized it with their paint. It's a noble gesture, but not a great place for therapy, right? But a pretty interesting call for design. And so several strategies are now under development to figure out like how we might approach this thing using accessible, community-centered means. First is establishing that new process of design that I mentioned before that's aligned with productive group dynamics. The next is looking at like, how can we foreground the use of reclaimed materials? Now, this is not new. I would argue that architects and designers, but architects especially, express advocacy through shopping. If you want to become more sustainable, you specify the green content drywall, not the normal stuff, right? Like our advocacy is largely around shopping because the methods we've designed, these largely linear, hierarchical, client-centered processes, don't allow us to fold robustly in the idiosyncratic reclaimed materials that we might find at places like this, right? They become burdensome and costly, which now all of a sudden we're producing really expensive design that's like super sustainable. So now it's sustainability for the wealthy, which I guess makes sense because the whole process, as I said before, was kind of designed to that end. And so thinking like, is there a different way that we can kind of foreground this material, not giving support to large corporate entities or their owners? We also felt like using primarily or exclusively reclaimed material, and right now we said exclusively as our goal. Maybe the exception of hardware, but I'm still not committed to not using reclaimed hardware. But as a powerful metaphor potentially about finding value in previously disregarded spaces like church basements or people like many of the communities in Jefferson Chalmers that have largely been ignored for decades and decades and decades and decades. And is there a way that the kind of redemptive story of those people as they receive the services that they much need and the space as it receives a much needed renovation might be mirrored with materials that are also kind of seeing a renovation? But at the same time, we have to be careful because I'm starting to buy into or insinuate a process where it's about this kind of precious customization, which is at odds with the scale that we need to operate at. Jefferson Chalmers is not alone in the predicaments I've outlined. There are a lot of communities just like that here in Detroit. And if you go out past Detroit, there are many, many more. And so we need to find a way to be able to do some of the things I'm talking about, but to do it at scale. And so I'm interested in looking at technology and how, and tip to Kurt if you're here or listening online and can hear me through the audio, bringing in Matterport scanning so as to help us figure out like how to produce the drawings for permitting, which are required to get really, really precise understanding of the basement space itself, which you can see here. Looking at how we might use AI, and this is a hat tip to Fielding International, who's been doing this for a little bit. How you create surveys that community members can input really easily. They're just speaking to their experience, but then you populate a prompt with that feedback. So imagine like, I keep calling it architectural Mad Libs, right? Where there's a kind of an AI prompt waiting with a bunch of blanks where you fill in an adjective, verb, et cetera, et cetera. And so the survey self-populates that, which then creates a prompt, which then creates an image. And so the community, now this one I would critique, like the images are way too similar. The prompt needs a lot of fixing. But as an idea, I think there's something there that I'm quite intrigued by. Because all of a sudden now we're leveraging technology to allow community members to express themselves in a language that closer approximates the thing. Like we're creating a meeting ground, right? Because we always produce stuff like this as a field to express our values and our ideas. Now we're trying to find a way to bring that communication more closely together. And also rethinking like digital fabrication, right? Like, and saying like, is there a way that we can create features in the design that absorb all of the complex burdens of that space, like everything, so that all the other parts of the design can be super simple, can be done with very, very simple tools, very, very simple processes, so that the community can all come together in a kind of a metaphorical barn raising, right? Because through the coming together in the building, the community is building an attachment to the space, a vestment in the space. And then actually even rethink and looking at digital fabrication, like there's nothing saying that the joints that we embed within that digitally fabricated piece can't be somewhat similar to the things you might see in an IKEA product, which by the way, a lot of members of the community have busted out the Allen wrenches and yelled in frustration as they've tried to put together a dresser. Like maybe there's a way there that even that part might become an accessible opportunity for people to roll up their sleeves and get into the work. And every person who gets into the work becomes theirs, right? It's co-owned, and if it's co-owned, then everyone cares for it, and the services offered might actually resonate even more. So using architecture to increase the resonance of the programmed activities. Now, while building the IDC, I became endlessly fascinated with housing. But I'm one person, so I can't do two things. right? It was like, so I focused on the IDC. So this idea kind of festered in my brain for while I was Temple and while I was at Louisiana. And then when I came here and eventually when I got here, I found an opportunity to begin to give voice to this idea that I've been ruminating for a while. And I was able to forge a second initiative around housing. Now, when I'm saying housing, I'm not talking about the 1% of homes that are designed by architects in the United States. I think those homes are just fine. We're doing a great job. Keep on keeping on. I'm talking about the 99% of homes that we don't touch. Because if I'm interested in the kind of impacts around ideas like affordability or sustainability or inclusivity or other markers that we use to define our current housing crisis, I'm not going to have any impact if I'm talking about the narrow 1% of homes on those markers. I'm only going to have an impact if I'm talking about the 99% of homes that actually are dictating the exploitation of our environment and other things in order to produce very cheap homes, right, for consumption. So I had to get at that. And by the way, there's also something rather irksome about that 99% in that they're still leveraging 150-year-old technology, right? Like the water-powered sawmill in the 1880s is why we have light frame construction. The industrially produced nail was around the same time, right? So light frame construction's been around for a minute. And so we're still producing things in this kind of antiquated way and then mystified that they're super expensive and relatively expensive and not exactly the highest quality. So this eventually led to founding a group called Home with my business partner, LTU graduate professor here. Shout out, they're having, I think, a watch party in their firm. They actually said it was going to be a mystery science theater thing, so I assume they're all silhouettes at the bottom making mocking comments. Hopefully this is a good opportunity right here. But we started Home, and the purpose was simple. Leverage new technology to create a smarter, more efficient housing delivery system so that we might build greener, stronger, and more cost-effective housing. Change the system to change the outputs. Technology to system to outputs. To illustrate, we can look at our first completed work, the Cochrane Home, which was built on a narrow North Corktown site in 2024. It was conceived as a prototype for attainable high-performance housing, the idea being delivering abundant spatial quality and environmental performance within a constrained budget and footprint. This is sited on a 30-foot by 100-foot lot. Detroit has tons of them, 31 feet if I'm being honest, which allows it to fall under the small lot provision in the code, which means we, in terms of setbacks, only have to save 8 or 12 feet, which we can distribute to either side as we want. So we push it all to one side so as to create a side yard, which means the house at its can be 18 feet wide. So the interior dimensions of the home you're about to see are 16 feet, because it's about a foot, give or take, given to the exterior walls. So a 16-foot wide house, constrained footprint. And the budget, we wanted to be aligned with that 99% of homes that I talked about, right? So the homes form an organization are founded upon a proprietary algorithm, which we developed to embrace compact massing, to reduce material use and energy loads, harvest passive heating and cooling, maximize daylight, natural ventilation, respond to context, and a variety of other factors. In short, to optimize form, orientation, and program layout in order to achieve the greatest social, economic, and environmental outcomes with the least resource input, all of which are measurable ideas, right? Now it's important to mention this was not designed by an algorithm. The algorithm provided us with a really fantastic data-driven foundation from which we could build the design. And so that we understood that the algorithm was giving us an optimized output. We can choose as designers to be suboptimal whenever we want. But at least now I can be suboptimal with some intelligence because I'm understanding I'm serving something that the algorithm didn't actually give. So as an example, at that point when we were working with this algorithm, the algorithm couldn't give a whit about context. And so it wanted a shed roof. And it wanted a shed roof because it wanted to harvest as much southern light as it possibly could in the winter because that's the largest load in terms of energy use. So it wanted to grab all that great southern sun. The problem, every other house in the neighborhood was a center peak, right? So at that time, we basically had to tell the algorithm, cool it, we're going center peak, we're suboptimal, sorry, right? But then the very next thing we did is program in a context-based evaluation tool within that algorithm so that the algorithm can have its own argument about context versus environmental stewardship that's on its own time. The homes form an organization, or the result is a light-filled, flexible home that feels larger than its compact footprint, again, 16 feet wide. Digitally Lee Sue asked me to point out the double height space right there, ID2 students. And there are a bunch of tricks that we use to make the space feel larger than it really is, and I'd be happy to talk through those during the Q&A if prompted. A digitally fabricated service core consolidates plumbing, mechanical, and electrical systems into two prefabricated units that are assembled off-site and brought onto site, assembled in like 3 hours on site. One serving the ADU, accessory dwelling unit in the back, the other serving the main living space. This streamlines construction, reduces on-site labor. This combination of off-site fabrication and simplified on-site assembly shorten the construction time from the normal 13 months to 8 months, minimized errors, and reduced waste generation by around 25% because you can consolidate the bits and parts that make up a home into sheets and nest them ahead of time with some intelligence, right? Material choices further reflect these ethics. Expose concrete floors, eliminate the need for added finishes, allow the radiant floor slab to really start to efficiently generate the heat that this house has a supplemental set of units, but it doesn't actually need to use them very often. Because of the double height space, heat does what? Rises, right? So rather than introduce heat up high where humans generally don't float, we introduce the heat down low where the heat does what? Passes through the body where you want it, right? In the case of the double height space, it then filters up top. Large fan helps to create that kind of circulation flow. Reclaimed tile used throughout, locally sourced cedar, and sustainably harvested bamboo flooring. Super insulated, airtight, and 100% recyclable envelope ensures long-term energy efficiency. This also was built off-site and then assembled on-site. The first floor was assembled, the first floor envelope was assembled in 1 day, second floor envelope in 1 day, and the roof in 2 days. There was a pause point in there because we had to build a floor to assemble the second floor, right? But other than that pause point, it was 4 days turnaround to get the envelope. These together, these systems create a high-performance building with low ongoing maintenance requirements and a markedly smaller environmental footprint. And we are data-driven folks, so share some data. The house was completed, and there are a lot of different ways you can factor it in. We made a bunch of mistakes. We can include soft costs. We can exclude soft costs. This excludes soft costs. 211.58 is the final tally on this thing. Average around 350. Now I will point out that 350 is for like the custom one-off house. When you go into the sprawling beige colored suburbs that we all know and love, you're getting closer to 175 because they're operating at a scale that we can't even approach. But it's a scale that we're quite keen to get into, which I'll talk about. And we think that 211 can come down a bit. Adjusted for inflation. It'll first go up because of inflation, and then we can bring it back down through scale. Time, as I already said, instead of 13 months, 8 months. Energy use, 25%, and waste reduction as well. Now, the design is not about the economy of a single house. It's a prototype. It wants to demonstrate how an architecture powered by computation, craft, and community can transform the economics of housing in places like Detroit and other cities that are in a similar space. And so doing the project is trying to redefine value in residential design. We're not about cheapness, we're about value, right? The goal is not to be as cheap as possible. The goal is to make the most use of the scarcest resources possible. Maximal, right? Utility, fewest, minimal means. And so the other goal is to do a scalable model. And we're really excited. So right now on the books, we've completed 2 homes. We have 2 that should be constructed here in the spring, one in Northport and one on 4th here in Detroit. Super excited about that. But what we're really excited about is we just signed on for several larger scale projects, an eco village of 40 units, a community of 9 homes, around 80% AMI. So kind of accessible housing, financially accessible housing here in Detroit, in a community that hasn't seen a new house for 50, 60 years. We're going to build 9 hopefully there. And then just finished a conversation around 500 homes, which scares the hell out of me, but I'm pretty excited because at that moment, and it's not, the other thing I should say, the algorithm allows us to generate 500 homes, but they're all unique and tailored to their unique situation. So unlike a lot of the beige suburbs we see where you get 500 homes and they're all just various shades of beige and the breakfast nook is in the south on this house and the north on this house and the east on this, right? Sometimes you're like, oh my God, the breakfast nook burned my eyes, right? Is all of these houses are designed to their unique situation, right? Which is very different. So it's allowing the 99% of homes that architects don't generally impact to be impacted in a small way by some of the intelligence we bring to the table. which does ask certain questions about, am I eroding like the value of architecture or whatever? But we can talk about that. I happily do it. But we are redefining value, offering a scalable model for equitable, efficient, and durable, enduring urban living. Interestingly, Home and Home's various partners, which I listed before, including 3 Squared, Guardian Panels, Runkle Consulting, and Living Edge, were honored to receive several awards for this work last year: the 2025 AI Detroit Honor Award for Housing, 2025 Michigan Honor Award for Housing, and most recently, the one I was really surprised about, the 2025 Architecture Master Prize competition. Although just an honorable mention, having our first prototype work be so honored in an international competition was kind of mind-blowing to me. Super excited, very grateful. And in a lot of ways, I'm equally like kind of surprised by the number of overlaps between the traditional markers of excellence within the field and what I thought was rabble-rousing work, right? Like I'm being um, awarded by the very people I'm trying to critique. Um, so I'm failing in my critique, I suppose. Or maybe like these commendations are an indicator of success, right? Or maybe I'm just providing that kind of feel-good story of do-gooderness within a field still very much dedicated to serving society's most powerful. Kind of a distracting enabler is what I am. I really don't know right now. I haven't lost sleep yet, but maybe soon on that question. But all of that is conversation for another day, or maybe for Q&A. Either way, I thank you for your time. I thank you for your patience as we dealt with audio. And I think we have questions, right? Is that what's happening? Interview? Yeah. Thanks, Scott. Absolutely. So do we take the phone with us? This is our mic, right?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, we have a mic that hopefully works.
I really wanted to use your phone. Oh, man. All right.
All right. I'm going to start us off, and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. First, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. A quick observation and then a question. I just thought it was really for the benefit of just kind of calling out what I thought was really interesting and useful in this context of an academic educational environment, like this experience you had of going this, as I wrote down, whiplash between the studio environment, the academic environment, and your work environment. This kind of like anxiety maybe that bred, but also what I feel like all of this came out of that
Right.
tension maybe of what you talked about a lot, and I wrote down right in the beginning, is value. Like it forced you to kind of think about like where am I in this? Like I enjoy the ideas, the sort of conversation around design work. I also enjoy working, but they're very different worlds. Like where am I in that? And I just thought like that's probably a very common experience in certain levels of being an architecture student because of the different nature of what we do. So I thought then from that, I thought it was interesting to think about all the way back to the beginning of pressure points. And is there a way that like that felt like a kind of maybe a pressure point, but in each of the projects you talked about, there's this kind of a similar kind of tension, right? Of like leveraging something instead of the sort of scarcity of an economic context of working in a practice, maybe the surplus of ideas and that kind of like, how do you leverage something between that? So could you just talk maybe kind of point to a couple of these pressure points and what that meant for you in maybe one or two of the projects?
I can't. That's a really great question. And I meant to say the word pressure point in the lecture. I didn't say the title of the lecture once. Philip is saying no, I didn't. I'm gonna say that's because I wanted you to find that overlap. Like I'm always an educator. First thing I'd say is like I've come to realize that discomfort I felt as a student was incredibly fruitful. I've come to believe that if you're not uncomfortable, you're not learning, right? Like learning is inherently confronting the unknown, and confronting the unknown is always uncomfortable, right? And you can try to kind of pull it back a little bit to be kind of at peace with it. But the really radical, interesting things that happen in your academic life will be those moments where you jump out into a space of incredible discomfort. And so I've come to like relish that experience. And I should have said I also had to apologize within my professional world for the work I did in the studio, right? Which was dismissed as fanciful, detached from reality, not aligned with the end user. right? These critiques were leveraged against the work I was doing in the studio. And then of course I'd come back to the studio and have to apologize for the amusement parks I designed over here, right? So I was no one liked me. Is what I'm trying to get at. So the idea of pressure points is like you have to understand first of all that you're confronting a really massive system that has a lot of inertia behind it, which is why I pointed at Brunelleschi's dome. Like these questions I'm asking, the first thing that I came to grips with is we've been asking them for a long time. And and that's wonderful because that means a lot of smart people, much smarter than I, have also been facing these questions, and I could learn a lot by reading what these individuals wrote, by looking at the work that these individuals, and I hope, when my time comes, right, to leave this planet, like I'll leave behind a little tiny step in that legacy that one of you all will pick up and run with, right? That's how we achieve any interesting change. But it's understanding the limitations. And I initially the idea of pressure points came from uh Culture Jam, which is a really great book if you've not read it. And Culture Jam talks about kind of building a counterculture revolution. And in this case, it's around mass consumer culture. That was that, and I was reading No Logo at the same time, both around like mass consumer culture. Um, one of which was written by a Canadian. Um, yeah. Um, but in there was an acknowledgement that there's a really massive system at play that's kind of propagating a set of ideas and tastes, and like we all kind of buy into it without signing anything. It's in the air and we kind of agree to it. It's the gravity, right, that defines our field. And you have to constantly push against it, which is super frustrating because it keeps pushing you the other way. But yet it's where we are. And they talked about like the impossibility in the martial arts when you're confronted with someone much larger than yourself of direct confrontation, right? If an NFL lineman ever came to me, I'm not doing this. That's a battle I would lose, right? I would actually run because I don't know martial arts, if I'm being honest. But if I did, like the whole goal would be you would redirect the force of the blow, right, of that 340 pound person against them by flipping, right? And that requires a lot of training. It requires a lot of intention. It requires a lot of knowledge as to like forces and how you can manipulate them. And I see it embedded in the work of like ad busters where like there was a famous ad, everyone here acquainted with the Marlboro Man from a long time ago, right? They used the Marlboro Man as a kind of a symbol of America and freedom and ruggedness, and then associate those really interesting things with smoking. And the idea being that a cigarette is how you become all of those things, rugged, et cetera, et cetera. And during the time where we were debating whether that was truthful or not and what was our attitude about smoking and cigarettes in general, adbusters came around and they started to use the Marlboro Man and as an ally in their counter narrative by taking the Marlboro Man or a cowboy that looks suspiciously like the Marlboro Man and putting it on a billboard that said, "Bob, I have emphysema," right? And what's interesting there is they took a character that the industry had plowed millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars into, and they flipped it on its head. Just like someone in the martial arts flipping the blow of a 340-pound person on its head. And you think you have to find ways to do that to have any kind of great impact. And the other thing I'll say is pressure points aren't identified right away. You're going to miss a lot before you hit one, or you're going to think you have a really great one and it's just not going to resonate. I can't tell you the last work, the school we did in South Africa, COVID hit, or not the school, the makerspace, COVID hit. We had to stay in this country. And so we couldn't keep doing the work. We didn't plan COVID. We didn't plan the travel. We just were stuck. And we went back several years later and we found that members of the community had used parts of this work to generate other things, which which was amazing because people generally are tied up into their own lives and they to get anyone to buy into what you're doing and then to act in this thing that you're doing and to make it their own is like a really hard thing to do. Um, and it took 20 years for us to get someone to borrow a few tectonic approaches around scrap material to build a bathroom, right? And no one else sees the victory there. It's like they built a bathroom. Yeah, okay. It's great. Get over yourself, right? But for us, it represented this like little glimmer of like, that's a change. That's a proof of concept, right? Uh, in a lot of ways, home exists because of a series of really fortunate guesses that things aligned a little better than we thought, right? Like we knew that the walls of a house aren't all equally expensive and equally complicated. Like we knew that certain walls that have plumbing, et cetera, are going to be more expensive. We're like, well, we probably want to make as few of those as possible. And to do that, we probably have to digitally fabricate it because now you got pipes flying all over the place, right? Common sense. But we didn't have the foresight to say, wow, we just consolidated the core, which generally speaking is a bunch of rooms that don't want windows, right? Have a bunch of walls and a bunch of equipment in there. So it's not really open. And so what we did is we like consolidated all the closed portions accidentally, consolidated all the closed portions of the program, which allowed the algorithm to open up a lot more of the house, which was an alignment that we recognized, we didn't necessarily foresee, right? It was something that emerged as these kind of two things that we wanted to squeeze on became a bigger thing. So now we're squeezing on that for all we're worth, right? You find them, right? And it's a lot of fits and starts. That's probably the long-winded way to. That's the pithy answer to your question. There.
Because it's both about like you can't always curate those things. You're not actually going directly for them, just like you described with the linebacker. Like you're not going directly for them necessarily, or they're happening along the way, and you have to have the kind of presence, awareness, observation to see them, and then to leverage. That was the other word I wrote down a lot, was leveraging these things for a particular approach, value, attitude that you have. I have, any number of other questions, but I'd like to hear from anyone in the audience. So someone like to.
I assume I have to repeat the question. Your law works. My law. Oh, so we can like interview people.
So and I'll give this to whoever may want to ask a question. Okay.
Amazing.
Lisu.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. I promise it isn't staged. But so I'm gonna confess that first, I've been to Cochrane House twice, and I will say that it probably tangentially inspired actually ID2's current project to a great degree, right? In your presentation, you actually mentioned value, right, several times because it's a sort of critical parameter. And I'm kind of wondering about things that are maybe not measurable, right? Like the things that I think the photos that you show light and space in a certain way, and I think that's the kind of thing about the double height space that typically if you're kind of working with a client, they would go, well, we're just wasting space there, right? I'm not getting the value. We should cover it up. We should make it a floor. These sorts of things. So I'm really interested because there's sort of calibration that you're kind of threading in between things that are really tough, right, in terms of hard constraints versus things that are intangible, and how do you kind of discuss value, let's say, in that sense?
Wow, that's a really great question. Totally not staged because I'm full next door second. I will say that we are still very much in the weeds, understanding the things that are somewhat measurable. But there are things that also define our reading of space that might be confused as qualitative, right? So we could argue, for example, that if one places, we know through physics, if one places a window closer to a corner, that the light that that window offers is going to go further into the space because the wall will help to push that light into the space. Physics has taught us that. That is just going to happen. I'm not ready to then get on a poetic soapbox to say what that means in terms of the kind of qualitative environment. I'm still in the space that, oh, more light into the space, especially within a tight quarter, seems like an overtly good thing. So we're going to do more of that, especially if it just means shifting windows to sides rather than centers. But there are moments where you also understand that when you're traveling down a large hallway and your eye ends in a wall, the space is going to feel closed. Whereas if your eye ends in a window, the space is going to feel open. Like we understand that psychologically too. And so what's interesting is when those two things compete with each other. It's like, okay, I only get one window. Am I ending the axis or am I bleeding light into the space? Right? And those sorts of choices are embedded throughout. Like And I've couched them kind of as suboptimal, but that was a bit of a loaded valuation, right? Because suboptimal assumes a certain amount of a certain relationship between the conditions, which actually our algorithm has to embed in it. And we're still busy figuring out which of those home believes for every house and which of those is negotiable for each specific house or each specific client, right? Which is a really interesting way of saying developing the algorithm is developing the mission of home, right? Like there's just kind of back and forth because that is our outputs are directly aligned with this thing. And so like if we are outputting in a way that's misaligned with our vision, something's wrong. Either the algorithm needs to be adjusted or our vision does. And so it's a really wonderful kind of back and forth. I will say the farther we travel, the obvious decisions become fewer and fewer, right? I still not exhausted them, but I can see it. When we first started, I couldn't even see it. Now I can see it. And this has started a series of conversations around the use of AI, which to this point, we have been using AI to help us position the company, to think through things. We had it develop we had a business plan developed through normal means, right, with actual human bio brains. And then we had a separate one developed through AI with an agent that we'd been training for a minute. And then we had a comparison contrast conversation. So we're using it, but right now AI has not touched the algorithm or its outputs because we're still in the if then proposition, right? We're still developing the knowns or the grounding. But as we get into these kind of devil's bargains, I can imagine that we would want to bring in other agents to help us make those decisions. That's prognostication, but I think that's true. And for the time, we're playing with physics.
Other questions? Yep.
Thank you for the lecture. It was a wonderful time. But what I want to focus on is you talked a bit about design methodologies when you were working on the church.
Yes.
You
Yep.
said you started working about it about a year ago and talked about all of
Right.
the barriers for entry and how you can really get to affecting those people. I was just curious if you can speak to a little more about how you've been removing those boundaries, because I know you said you did a survey and you put it into like a Mad
Yeah.
Lib AI thing. Just what have you been doing or what did you do to help remove those barriers, and what have you been doing since?
Okay. That's a really great question. And we just have glimmers there, right? Um, so I'll use the AI thing that you talked about. It embeds several approaches that are better than the traditional community-based meeting that we know and love. Thing one is it allows for the simultaneous accumulation of insight, where instead of having person A speak, then person B, then person C, then person D, which of course person B is impacted by whatever person A said, we have persons A through Z all simultaneously say something based on a set of prompts. And then we judge, we have all of the results that are unpolluted by the conversations of other people. So we can start to pull out common strands and ideas through the kind of simultaneous accumulation of diverse insight. That's kind of one of the parameters we're trying to figure out how to implant in most of the design, right? Simultaneous. And it's not, there's a really great book for those who are interested called Wisdom of Crowds. Sarah Wecky is the writer. It's there that I learned that the betting line of the Mirage is the greatest prognosticator of future sports outcomes on the planet because it does exactly what I said. Simultaneous accumulation of diverse insight where everyone's using their own kind of background and research. They're all motivated because they all got money on the line to do their best. That's the best predictor of the future, which is like mind blowing to me, right? But it's an example of how people together can be super smart, right? But we've also seen people together, like the madness of crowds is as common an outcome as the wisdom, actually more common than the wisdom of crowds. And so it's figuring out how you get the wisdom of crowds as many times as possible, as well as pushing against the madness. Um, Another answer to that, I think, is the building of people's understanding of the work through their direct exposure to it on an equal platform. So we're all painting together. Architect, community member, owners of all those nonprofits, whatever, we're all just picking up a paintbrush, well, hopefully a roller, right? We're all, maybe even a spray gun. Like we're all like doing the work though. which creates a platform of exchange where there's some equity, some vestment, and our hope that that can breed a certain set of conversations that also could be useful. And then how do you carry the conversations through as you get into the invention of things, right? Like the digitally fabricated component, I have lots of logical reasons for that. But like, how do I understand the community's reading of that, right? Like we've had a huge conversation about the kind of sharpness of the geometry and whether or not that is actually opposed to the idea of therapy, right? Where you don't want a jarring environment necessarily. And so now I'm getting into, okay, do we pursue that through conversations with the community? Do we pursue that with literature review to try to understand how geometry and therapy align? Which sounds a lot like the whole physics and light question that I answered a second ago, right? I gave you a couple examples. You have to invite me back in a couple of years and then I'll have smarter things to say. Because it's all very new. Like, it's very much in its infancy.
I'm going to just take one of the questions that was on and sit over here so it doesn't look so.
I'm so lonely. Yeah.
Um, that was online from Maggie, who was asking about the AMI project. And are there any updates on that you can share?
What can I share is the question. So that project, I can say it's South Detroit, Southwest, obviously. I can say it's 9 units. I could say that the units are of varying types and approaches because the goal is not 9 homes, but 100 and some odd. And they want the community to be able to kind of walk through and see what's kind of available within the price point that we are working towards. I can say that it's caused some really interesting conversations about what you punt on in order to get it to that price point, and where does it become about value, cheapness? Like, how do you still contend with this? Like and I've long held like you don't understand something till you push past its limits and kind of break the thing, and then you understand it. Like you don't understand a thing by constantly existing in its center. You only understand a thing by pushing in its edges. That's where you understand it. And I think that project's doing that to us. Like we're trying to understand like what is the kind of fringe in this kind of affordability or cost effectiveness space. They vary in scale pretty significantly. I think there's an 800 square foot unit, and I believe there's like a 1,600 square foot unit as well, 1,700 square foot unit. But the goal is, and they're all within a single block. It's also prompted some really interesting conversations. Like Detroit built their city based on the premise of having alleys, right? And there's all houses have a front and back side, which makes there's all sorts of good reasons to do that, right? But it also leads to things that may get in the way of building homes. So as an example, the Cochrane home that I shared, to tap into the lines on both the front and the back side of the house was a $35,000 proposition, which is why when we went to Indiana, we were able to pump out a house at $194 a square foot, because that was like, I want to say like $4,000 to do the same thing. So we had $30,000 overcharge here in Detroit. All the trades were more expensive, et cetera, et cetera. In that particular project, going back to that project, the alley is in complete disrepair, like can't use it. And so there's an argument, because in the city code, it says that the residents are responsible for upkeep, right? They're responsible for upkeep. But what happens when there's no residents for 70 years, right? That's not upkeep anymore. That is complete rebuilding. And so who's responsible for the complete rebuilding of an alley? And more importantly, all of the infrastructure that's under that alley, right? The wastewater systems, et cetera, et cetera. It's not an inexpensive thing. Even when you're dividing that cost by 9 homes or whatever it may be, it's still a hell of a line item to saddle houses that are trying to hit this price point. And so to be honest, like it's given me a lot of insight into how architects are only a very small sliver of the conversation. And like and we, by the way, Home is not an architecture firm. We're a design technology firm. I feel like I need to say that. And it's because architects don't do housing. We just don't. We do 1%. And so we're interested in like leveraging design technology. There's that word again, drinking game. Using design technology in a way that allows us to get into the kind of space of real production. But even under that understanding, we're still a very narrow slice. Like there's so much that happens before us and after us that are incredibly influential. And this negotiation around like who pays to upkeep the alley, like those things kill projects, right? And you're going to be like scratching your head, like, why didn't those great houses get built? Well, because no one could agree on who's going to pay for the alley, who's going to take the $250,000 hit on that, right? And are you going to divide it by 9? And someone else can do the math, but like, right, 25K added on to each house for an infrastructure, then each house has got to cost like $180,000 or $160,000. So now each house costs $135,000. And you can't even get a foundation in the ground really for less and actually tap into water, right, and grade the site for like 70. So now what do you got left for the architecture? 60? You can't build a house for 60K. You just can't. And so it's these kind of bigger questions about like what goes in the ground, right? Who builds the infrastructure that has to be asked and answered. And it's likely the reason that when we pulled the permit for the Cochran home, we were one of 8 homes in the entire city of Detroit to pull a permit, single family homes. We're great with townhouses. We do those all the time, right? But single family houses, which by the way is what families want, 80% of families in Michigan, if you ask them what they want, they'll say single family house. Detroit built 8 of them the year we built this. The year before, they built 8 of them. And it's because of these questions, not the architect, right? Not the designer. It's these bigger questions that are thwarting efforts to realize housing. It's a political question, right? As much as anything.
I think we'll call it there. I know a lot of you have to get to class at 2. I just want to say the 9, for those of you who are in ID4, that 9 rings a bell, right? We're going to talk about your 9 block units tomorrow, 3 scenarios by 3 equals 9. So it's very fitting, very aligned. I also want to mention we in lab had Samantha Eby yesterday give a talk about from rehousing and this thing about parametrics and thinking about the variables and parameters of housing in particular was super interesting and related again to what we learned about in lab yesterday in 94. So
amazing.
Please again join me in thanking Scott Shaw for the wonderful